The very first Army chaplain I ever knew is Pastor Wayne J. Lehrer. He was the pastor of Our Redeemer Lutheran Church, where my mother, my sister, and I attended church growing up. The last opportunity I had to see him was one I could not take advantage of. It was a send-off party for him. He was becoming a U.S. Army chaplain, and it was too much for me to deal with emotionally as a child. I knew that all I would do at the party was cry, and I didn't want to do that, so I stayed home. I had spent years watching the Vietnam War on television. I had no idea that things were winding down over there. I thought he was going to go over there and get killed or become a POW. I couldn't stand the thought of it. Why did he have to go? It was too much for me, and even today when I think back on those days, I feel a weight of grief about it. Even though now as an adult, I understand and I love him all the more for it. It was less than a decade later when I enlisted in the U.S. Army. I looked up Chaplain Major Lehrer and intended to write him a letter to let him know what had become of me and let him know that I had come to understand why he chose to follow his calling to serve God in the U.S. Army. I so wish I had actually sat down and wrote that letter. Instead, I have this video production of a Christmas story that I read every year. It is a story that involves a lot of Army chaplains and a lot of Lutherans. Every time I read this story, I think about Pastor Lehrer. He was and always will be one of my greatest heroes in life. Chaplain Colonel Lehrer, Infantry Sergeant Silas wishes you and your family a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. All the way, sir. One of the things we all enjoy during the Christmas holiday season are Christmas stories. We all have our favorites, those stories that take us somewhere. Maybe it takes us to a different place or time, and wherever or whenever that is, makes us feel different. It makes us more contemplative. These things usually give us a greater appreciation for the holiday. This helps to put us in a proper holiday spirit. The story that I'm sharing with you now is one of my favorite Christmas stories. It takes place during the most brutal Christmas season that the American people have ever endured. I gravitate toward this story every Christmas because it is part of the history of the division that I served with during my time in the U.S. Army. When the war was over and the All-American Division marched down Broadway in New York City, most of the guys in the formation had never seen combat. They were replacements for the paratroopers who died during the Christmas season of 1944. In all, 19,000 Americans were killed, 47,500 were wounded, and 23,000 went missing in action during the Battle of the Bulge. There was no household in America that didn't have a family member or friend who was either killed or wounded in that great battle. My great-uncle Richard was wounded there. German soldiers found him and kept him from bleeding to death. Then they asked him to help them surrender. Mr. Wilson, the old paratrooper from my division who lived at the end of the street, was wounded, captured, and escaped. Mr. Hamilton, the railroad engineer who introduced us kids to pro wrestling, fought in the Battle of the Bulge. The battle had an impact on our society that is hard to measure because it touched us as a people in so many ways. It's hard to quantify how we changed forever because of what happened in Europe in December of 1944. As bad as it was, it could have been much worse. We actually won the battle. German casualties were several times worse, if that is even imaginable. Had they achieved their objectives, the Allied armies would have been divided and cut off from their port of supply. Without fuel, ammunition, and food, the Allied armies would be unable to maneuver and fight within just a few short days. The margin between victory and defeat in World War II was razor thin. That's why Hitler decided to roll the dice one more time. We had many gifted and capable generals who were leading our armies, but one general in particular perceived the danger of their situation before the enemy began their last great offensive. He realized that there were only two things that he could do to change the situation on the battlefield. The general knew that he needed to pray, and that he needed to order the men under his command to also pray. This is a story of the power of prayer offered in faith by mighty men of valor who humbled themselves before God in the face of their enemy. May it be a story that we will never forget. May it be a story that we will tell our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren about. May every generation of Americans know this story and know that it is just one example of many of how Almighty God has poured out His blessings on us. As He is faithful, may we also be faithful. This is taken from the publication The Review of the News on October 6, 1971. Many conflicting and some untrue stories have been printed about George S. Patton and the Third Army Prayer. Some have had a tinge of blasphemy and disrespect for the deity, even in War as I Knew It by General Patton. The footnote on the prayer by Colonel Paul D. Harkins, Patton's deputy chief of staff, while containing the elements of a funny story about the general and his chaplain, is not the true account of the prayer incident or its sequence. As chief chaplain of the Third Army throughout the 5 campaigns on the staff of General Patton, I should have some knowledge of the event because at the direction of General Patton, I composed the now world-famous prayer and wrote training letter number 5, which constitutes an integral but untold part of the prayer story. These incidents, narrated in sequence, should serve to enhance the memory of the man himself and cause him to be enshrined by generations to come as one of the greatest of our soldiers. He had all the traits of military leadership, fortified by genuine trust in God, intense love of country, and high faith in the American soldier. He had no use for half measures. He wrote this line a few days before his death: "Anyone in any walk of life who is content with mediocrity is untrue to himself and to American tradition." He was true to the principles of his religion, Episcopalian, and was a regular in church attendance and practices, unless duty made his presence impossible. The incident of the now famous Patton prayer commenced with a telephone call to the Third Army chaplain on the morning of December 8, 1944, when the Third Army headquarters was located in the Caserne Montliffard in Nancy, France. "This is General Patton. Do you have a good prayer for weather? We must do something about these rains if we are to win the war." My reply was that I know where to look for such a prayer and that I would locate it and report within the hour. As I hung up the telephone receiver at about 11 in the morning, I looked out on the steadily falling rain. Immoderate, I would call it. The same rain that had plagued Patton's army throughout the Moselle and Sarre campaigns from September until now, December 8th. The few prayer books at hand contained no formal prayer on weather that might prove acceptable to the Army commander. Keeping his immediate objective in mind, I typed an original and an improved copy on a 5x3 filing card. "Almighty and most merciful Father, we humbly beseech thee of thy great goodness to restrain these immoderate rains with which we have had to contend. Grant us fair weather for battle. Graciously hearken to us as soldiers who call upon thee that, armed with thy power, we may advance from victory to victory and crush the oppression and wickedness of our enemies and establish thy justice among men and nations." To each officer and soldier in the 3rd United States Army, I wish a Merry Christmas. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We march in our might to complete victory. May God's blessings rest upon each of you on this Christmas Day. Signed, G.S. Patton, Jr., Lieutenant General, Commanding 3rd United States Army. This done, I donned my heavy trench coat, crossed the quadrangle of the old French military barracks, and reported to General Patton. He read the prayer copy and returned it to me with a very casual directive: have 250,000 copies printed and see to it that every man in the Third Army gets one. The size of the order amazed me. This was certainly doing something about the weather in a big way. But I said nothing but the usual, "Very well, sir." Recovering, I invited his attention to the reverse side containing the Christmas greeting with his name and rank typed. "Very good," he said with a smile of approval. And I said if the general would just sign the card, it would add a personal touch that I'm sure the men would like. He took his place at his desk, signed the card, returned it to me, and then said, "Chaplain, sit down for a moment. I want to talk to you about this business of prayer." He rubbed his face in his hands, was silent for a moment, then rose and walked over to the high window and stood there with his back toward me as he looked out on the falling rain. As usual, he was dressed stunningly, and his 6'2" powerfully built physique made an unforgettable silhouette against the great window. The General Patton I saw there was the Army commander to whom the welfare of the men under him was a matter of personal responsibility. Even in the heat of combat, he would take time out to direct new methods to prevent trench foot, to see to it that dry socks went forward daily with the rations to the troops on the front line, to deal in the mud administering morphine and caring for a wounded soldier until the ambulance came. What was coming now? "Chaplain, how much praying is being done in the Third Army?" was his question. I parried, "Does the general mean by chaplains or by the men?" "By everybody," he replied. To this I countered, "I'm afraid to admit it, but I do not believe that much praying is going on. When there is fighting, everyone prays, but now with this constant rain, when things are quiet, dangerously quiet, men just sit and wait for things to happen. Prayer out here is difficult. Both chaplains and men are removed from a special building with a steeple. Prayer to most of them is a formal, ritualized affair involving special posture and a liturgical setting. I do not believe that much praying is being done." The general left the window and again seated himself back at his desk, leaned back in his swivel chair, and toyed with a long lead pencil between his index fingers. Chaplain, I am a strong believer in prayer. There are 3 ways that men get what they want: by planning, by working, and by praying. Any great military operation takes careful planning or thinking. Then you must have well-trained troops to carry it out. That's working. But between the plan and the operation, there is always an unknown. That unknown spells defeat or victory, success or failure. It is the reaction of actors to the ordeal when it actually comes. Some people call that getting the breaks. I call it God. God has his part, or margin, in everything. That's where prayer comes in. Up to now, in the Third Army, God has been very good to us. We have never retreated. We have suffered no defeats, no famine, no epidemics. This is because a lot of people back home are praying for us. We were lucky in Africa, in Sicily, and in Italy, simply because people prayed. But we have to pray for ourselves too. A good soldier is not made merely by making him think and work. There is something in every soldier that goes deeper than thinking or working. It's his guts. It is something that he has built in there. It is a world of truth and power that is higher than himself. Great living is not all output of thought and work. A man has to have intake as well. I don't know what you call it, but I call it religion, prayer, or God. He talked about Gideon in the Bible, said that men should pray no matter where they were, in church or out of it, that if they did not pray, sooner or later they would crack up. To all this, I commented agreement that one of the major training objectives of my office was to help soldiers recover and make their lives effective in this third realm, prayer. It would do no harm to re-impress this training on chaplains. We had about 486 chaplains in the Third Army at the time, representing 32 denominations. Once the Third Army had become operational, my mode of contact with the chaplains had been chiefly through training letters issued from time to time to the chaplains in the 4 Corps and the 22 to 26 divisions comprising the Third Army, each treated of a variety of subjects of corrective or training value to a chaplain working with troops in the field. The general continued, I wish that you would put out a training letter on this subject of prayer to all the chaplains. Write about nothing else, just the importance of prayer. Let me see it before you send it. We've got to get not only the chaplains, but every man in the Third Army to pray. We must ask God to stop these rains. These rains are that margin that hold the defeat or victory. If we all pray, it will be like what Dr. Carroll said. The allusion was to a press quote some days previously when Dr. Alexis Carrel, one of the foremost scientists, described prayer as one of the most powerful forms of energy that a man can generate. It will be like plugging in on a current whose source is in heaven. I believe that prayer completes that circuit. It is power. With that, the general arose from his chair, a sign that the interview was ended. I returned to my field desk and typed training letter number 5 while the copy was hot, touching on some or all of the general's reverie on prayer, and after staff processing, presented it to General Patton on the next day. The general read it and, without change, directed that it be circulated not only to the 486 chaplains, but to every organization commander, down to and including the regimental level. 3,200 copies were distributed to every unit in the Third Army over my signature as Third Army chaplain. Strictly speaking, it was the Army commander's letter, not mine. Due to the fact that the order came directly from General Patton, distribution was completed on December 11th and 12th in advance of its dateline, December 14th, 1944. Titled Training Letter Number 5 with the salutatory Chaplains of the Third Army, the letter continued, at this stage of the operation, I would call upon the chaplains and the men of the 3rd United States Army to focus their attention on the importance of prayer. Our glorious march from the Normandy beach across France to where we stand, before and beyond the Siegfried Line, with the wreckage of the German army behind us, should convince the most skeptical soldier that God has ridden with our banner. Pestilence and famine have not touched us. We have continued in unity of purpose. We have had no quitters, and our leadership has been masterful. The Third Army has no roster of retreats, none of defeats. We have no memory of a lost battle to hand on to our children from this great campaign. But we are not stopping at the Siegfried Line. Tough days may be ahead of us before we eat our rations in the chancellery of the Deutsches Reich. As chaplains, it is our business to pray. We preach its importance. We urge its practice. But the time is now to intensify our faith in in prayer, not alone with ourselves, but with every believing man, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, or Christian in the ranks of the 3rd United States Army. Those who pray do more for the world than those who fight. And if the world goes from bad to worse, it is because there are more battles than there are prayers. Hands lifted up, said Bossuet, smash more battalions than hands that strike. Gideon of the Bible fame was the least in his father's house. He came from Israel's smallest tribe, but he was a mighty man of valor. His strength lay not in his military might, but in his recognition of God's proper claims upon his life. He reduced his army from 32,000 to 300 men, lest the people of Israel would think that their valor had saved them. We have no intention to reduce our vast striking force, but we must urge, instruct, and indoctrinate every fighting man to pray as well as fight. In Gideon's day, as in our own, spiritually alert minorities carry the burdens and bring the victories. Urge your men to pray not alone in church, but everywhere. Pray when driving, pray when fighting, pray alone, pray with others, pray by night and pray by day. Pray for the cessation of immoderate rains. Pray for good weather for battle. Pray for the defeat of our wicked enemy, whose banner is injustice and whose good is oppression. Pray for victory. Pray for our army and pray for peace. We must march together, all out for God. The soldier who cracks up does not need sympathy or comfort as much as he needs strength. We are not trying to make the best of these days. It is our job to make the most of them. Now is not the time to follow God from far off. The army needs the assurance and faith that God is with us. With prayer, we cannot fail. Be assured that this message on prayer has the approval, the encouragement, and the enthusiastic support of the 3rd United States Army Commander. With every good wish to each of you for a happy Christmas and my personal congratulations for your splendid and courageous work since landing on the beach, I am, etc., etc., signed the 3rd Army Commander. The timing of the prayer story is important. Let us rearrange the dates. The prayer conference with General Patton was 8 December. The 664th Engineer Topographical Company, at the order of Colonel David H. Tully, Chief Engineer, assistant to the 3rd Army Engineer, working night and day, reproduced 250,000 copies of the prayer card. The Adjutant General, Colonel Robert S. Cummings, supervised the distribution of both the prayer cards and training letter number 5 to reach the troops by December 12th through the 14th. The breakthrough was on December 16th in the 1st Army Zone when the Germans crept out of the Schnee-Eifel forest in the midst of heavy rains, thick fogs, and swirling ground mist. That muffled sound blotted out the sun and reduced visibility to a few yards. The few divisions on the Luxembourg frontier were surprised and brushed aside. They found it hard to fight an enemy that they could neither see nor hear. For 3 days, it looked to the jubilant Nazis as if their desperate gamble would succeed. They had achieved complete surprise. Their 6th Panzer Army, rejuvenated in secret after its debacle in France, seared through the Ardennes like a hot knife through butter. The 1st Army's 8th Corps was holding this area with 3 infantry divisions, one of them new and in the line only a few days, thinly disposed over an 88-mile front with 1 armored division far to the rear in reserve. The 8th Corps had been in the sector for months. It was considered a semi-rest area and outside of a little patrolling was wholly an inactive position. When the blow struck, the 8th Corps fought with imperishable heroism. The Germans were slowed down, but the Corps was too shattered to stop them with its remnants. Meanwhile, to the north, the 5th Panzer Army was slugging through another powerful prong along the vulnerable boundary between the 8th and 6th Corps. Had the bad weather continued, there is no telling how far the Germans might have advanced. On the 19th of December, the 3rd Army turned from east to north to meet the attack. As General Patton rushed his divisions north from the Saar Valley to the relief of the beleaguered Bastogne, the prayer was answered. On December 20th, to the consternation of the Germans and the delight of the American forecasters, who were equally surprised at the turnabout, the rains and the fog ceased. For the better part of a week came bright, clear skies and perfect flying weather. Our planes came over by the tens, hundreds, and thousands. They knocked out hundreds of tanks, killed thousands of enemy troops in the Bastogne salient, and they harried the enemy as he valiantly tried to bring up reinforcements. The 101st Airborne Division, with the 4th, 9th, and 10th Armored Divisions, which saved Bastogne, and other divisions which assisted so valiantly in driving the Germans home, will testify to the great support rendered by our air forces. General Patton prayed for fair weather for battle. He got it. It was late in January of 1945 when I saw the Army commander again. This was in the city of Luxembourg. He stood directly in front of me, smiled, and said, "Well, Padre, our prayers work." I knew they would. Then he cracked me on the side of my steel helmet with his riding crop. That was his way of saying, "Well done." This article appeared as a government document in 1950. At the time it appeared in the Review of the News, Monsignor O'Neill was a retired brigadier general living in Pueblo, Colorado. General Patton survived the war and was appointed to the post of military governor of Bavaria. A year and a day after the prayer conference with Chaplain O'Neill, the general was injured in a freak accident when a 2.5-ton Army supply truck swerved into the path of the general's staff car. 1 year after the skies cleared over the Bastogne salient, God called his general home. The general was a man of war, but his war was finally over as he entered into eternal peace. On Christmas Eve 1945, the general was laid to rest at the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg, alongside his men per his request. There will be many times in our lives when the world will seem to be going from bad to worse. There will be many times when we will feel overwhelmed and surrounded by the enemy. There will be many times when we will feel absolutely hopeless. That's when we need to remember the story of the Third Army Prayer of December 1944. God hears the prayers of his children, and he will not let them fall into the hands of the enemy. The sky will clear, the sun will shine, his provision and rescue will rain down just in time, like it always does. Have faith and hold on. Our enemy is defeated, and that is the greatest Christmas story of all time.
Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright, around young virgin, mother and child, holy infant, so tender and mild, sleep in heavenly peace, sleep in heavenly peace. Silent night, holy night, shepherds quake at the sight, glory stream from heaven afar, heavenly hosts sing hallelujah. Christ the Savior is born. Christ the Savior is born. Silent night, holy night, Son of God, love's pure light, radiant beams from thy holy face, with the dawn of redeeming grace. Jesus, Lord, at thy birth. Jesus, Lord, at thy birth. Silent night, holy night, wondrous star, lend thy light, with the angels let us sing. Hallelujah to our King. Christ the Savior is born. Christ the Savior is born.
Hold that line in your hand for just a moment and remember the words of Jesus, who said, "As long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world." And then Jesus later in another place said that you and I, we're the light of the world. So in a moment when we extinguish the flame, we want to remember We're the light of the world. And as we go out into that world, we don't want to just curse the darkness. We want to turn on the light. Amen? Amen. God bless you. Merry Christmas. And you're dismissed.